but I'm Bob Wolf, Chair of SPICE. On behalf of the SPICE Committee and the SPICE Program Subcommittee, I'd like to welcome you all to the first SPICE program in our winter-spring 2021 season. We want to wish you all a happy and especially a healthy new year. Today's speaker is Dr. Dan Morrill, who talked to us about the early development of Charlotte's most desirable neighborhoods, Myers Park, Dilworth, and Eastover. We also have a great lineup of programs ahead, including our next program, which is, and mark this on your calendar, it's Thursday, not Wednesday, Thursday, January 21st at 11 a.m. The Star of David, A Complicated History, with Rabbi Beth Nichols, who's our Director of Education, and this will be her first SPICE program with us. She's a great speaker, and I'm sure it's going to be a fabulous program, so y'all should plan on tuning in, and please tell your friends to join us as well. We'd like to give her a good welcome. Also, after a 2-year hiatus, SAGE is back. And I know a number of you have done SAGE over the years, 10 or 12 years. And this will meet on the 4th Wednesday of each month through May, starting January 27th. This year's topic is very, very hot topic, combating the machinery of hate, anti-Semitism as us. It'll go into the history of it, what the current issues are, and conclude with what can we do about it. And this is going to be led by Rabbi Knight, as well as Donna Tarney of the Greenspon Center. He's an expert on this. And it's going to be a really, really, I think, enjoyable and informative and lively session. And you can get the details up online. This is a limited number of people. You have to register for the class, and the openings are closing quickly. So I'd advise you, if you haven't done so, to please go up and register and join us for this wonderful event. Now to introduce Dr. Morrill, here's the co-chair of our program subcommittee, Stefan Pinckney. Stefan?
Good morning, everybody. Many of you have seen or heard Dan speaking before to us about different historical portions of Charlotte and Mecklenburg area in North Carolina. I met Dan, over 30 years ago when I took a leadership course through the Chamber of Commerce, the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce. And he took us on a tour bus throughout Mecklenburg County. And I was astounded by his incredible knowledge of local history about the different areas, going way back. Found out at that time that he was a professor of history at UNCC for many, many years. He's now a retired professor. Other things that Dan has done, being concerned that Charlotte was losing a lot of its old historical places. He was one of the founders of Charlotte Mecklenburg Historic Properties Commissions, where he became the historian and the executive director of the organization that preserved, and until today preserves, many, many historical buildings and sites for Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. He recently, about a year and a half ago or so, was a former of another organization, which is a nonprofit called PMI, Preservation Mecklenburg, Inc. And we've had an incredible success since then of saving several properties, some that are not even designated historic, but they are very important to the history of Charlotte and Mecklenburg, and they have been saved. And I can tell you, he'll probably tell you a little bit more later about PMI, Preservation Mecklenburg Inc. Here is Dan.
Well, I'm gonna share my screen. And is everybody up? Can you see a history of Myers Park? Can everybody see that?
We couldn't, it just went away. We're seeing your face now.
No, I see a history of Myers Park.
I see it.
I see it.
I see it also.
I see it too. I think it must.
I see it.
Okay, good. Well, I've shared my screen. First of all, let me say thank you for letting me come. I'm glad to do it. And I don't mind being interrupted. So if you want to ask a question or you want to interrupt, please feel free to do so. And also, if I start running on too long, tell me and I'll shut up. My ego doesn't need to be pandered to at all. And I'm going to really focus on Myers Park because for the sake of time, I could come back and do a whole thing on Eastover. I could do a whole thing on Dilworth, but I wanted to focus on Myers Park because it really was this seminal event. And I've purposely labeled it A History of Myers Park. I don't claim by any means to know everything at all about Myers Park. And I wanted to talk about two terms right up front because I think these are important to understand, and I'm sure many of you do. And that's the natural environment and the built environment. The natural environment essentially is what God creates. It's what's here on this earth and this planet if human beings were not here. The built environment is by its very nature anthropocentric. It's what human beings do. It's the spaces, the places, the elements that human beings construct. And we live both obviously in a natural environment and we also live in a built environment. And I have a devotion to both, although professionally I am primarily involved in dealing with the built environment. Now, I'm going to be talking about Myers Park, but I know some of you are going to say, well, now, Myers Park is beautiful. Was all of Charlotte like Myers Park? The obvious answer is no. This is a rather graphic and provocative photograph. The building in the background is the historic Mecklenburg County Courthouse. It still stands on East Trade Street, although you're looking essentially from what is now Marshall Park across the 4th Street to the rear of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. And this is what is known traditionally as the Brooklyn neighborhood locally. Technically, it was the Second Ward neighborhood, and this photograph would have been made, you can tell from the photographs over there, this would have been made in the early 1950s, but it reflects what was a large part of Charlotte. And when you think about our current situation, our current circumstance, and with the political leadership of Charlotte today and our elected officials, and you look at this photograph, it's rather graphic. But I just wanted to, I guess, pre-answer some of the questions that some of you might have, and that is, was Myers Park typical? No, it was not typical. And if you want to really read about Myers Park, there's a very, very good book co-written by Mary Norton Kratt and Dr. Thomas Hanchett, and it's published by the Myers Park Homeowners Association, but it's much more than just a picture book. It's a book that truly does give a good, solid history of Myers Park. And Myers Park is worth a history. And legacy, the Myers Park story, quite frankly, I don't know if it's currently in print or not, but I would get in touch with the Myers Park Homeowners Association, or Tom Hanchett would certainly know whether or not it's in print. But it's far more comprehensive, far more in depth than anything I'm going to say. So just want to make that. Now let's first of all talk about who it's named for. This is John Springs Myers, or he was known as Jack Myers. You can see the years of his life. And this is the man who owned the land that Myers Park was developed on. And he was from a very prominent family. He was Christian, Episcopalian. His family had a sense of social justice. In fact, his father donated the land where Johnson C. Smith University was constructed. And also, as I'll show you in just a moment, he was someone who truly had an aesthetic sense. Now, the Myers Park that I'm going to talk about is not the first Myers Park. The Myers Park I'm going to talk about is the 1912 Myers Park. That's when it opened. But you can see that Jack Myers, who owned this farm that I'm going to show you in terms of a map just in a moment, he had already started developing something that he called Myers Park on the Providence Road, because he did have a sense of aesthetic. He had a sense of the fact that the built environment should be something that was not just functional, that didn't just reflect the demands of the engineer, but also reflected the demands of the artist, that the built environment should be manipulated to be a beautiful place. And people, when they travel by buggy and wagon along Providence Road in 1902, were already talking about how beautiful it was. Now, this is a fascinating map. You'll notice that this map is from 1905. Now, I'm going to show you, right, this is where Jack Myers lived. He had a farmhouse right here. And you can see that what we're looking at basically is the Providence Road area. If I can make this thing go back, it's not wanting to do. Anyway, he was, but let's look at this map a minute. This is Caswell. Caswell came down to Providence. We'll look in a moment and see that Providence Road did not really go through as it does today until 1961. Providence Road is named for the fact that it went to Providence Presbyterian Church. And you'll see that it came past Mr. Myers's farm. And you see, here was the original Myers Park. In fact, this loop is there to this day. This is Hermitage Road. This is Ardsley Road. This loop is there to this day. But it came down past here, and this intersection with the little dotted line going straight was a dirt road. This road had been improved, which was the Providence Road. And you notice that that intersection is still there to this day. There's a, if any of you know, there's a Harris Teeter that's right here at this intersection. And that intersection is still, if you will, with us. These were a group of tenant farms that Mr. Myers had. I live on Middleton Drive, and Middleton Drive goes right down here, Cottage Place, Perrin Place, Huntley. Those are all former tenant farms. And these were tenant houses that existed right along that street. And you'll also notice, talking about Mr. Jack Myers's sense of social responsibility, He was the one who developed Cherry. Cherry was developed prior to the 1912 Myers Park. And he purposely wanted to give African Americans a place where they could own homes, not live in that squalor that you saw in Brooklyn or Second Ward, that would have tree-lined streets, that would have a sense of aesthetic. And so it was originally known as Cherrytown or Cherryton, now known as Cherry. And of course, it's going through a major transformation to this day. And so that's just fascinating that he actually started, if you will, looking at this area before we got involved. I could go on and on about this map. I mean, the Watkins Farm is where Eastover was. The Forest Farm is where Forestdale is. This, of course, this was the beginning here of Sharon Road, because Providence Road was named because it went to Providence Presbyterian Church. Sharon Road was named because it went to Sharon Presbyterian Church. This, of course, now goes straight down to where Myers Park Baptist Church is, you know, where we're talking about many. And this was the road that was built to go to Dilworth, that went basically over to Dilworth, and which is now, of course, Moorhead Street. Now, let me get to the 1912 Myers Park. One of, a person, usually when you see something as extraordinary, and there's no doubt about the fact that the 1912 Myers Park was extraordinary. You usually go back, you almost always go back to somebody, a person. And there's no question that this man on the left, George Stevens, 1873 to 1946, was the man who had the vision. George Stevens was a native of Guilford County, Greensboro area. He was a graduate of the University of North Carolina. Interestingly enough, he is reportedly the first collegiate football player who ever caught a forward pass. But that's another story in itself. He was an absolutely superb athlete, an excellent baseball pitcher. He came to Charlotte after he graduated from the University at Chapel Hill in the early 1900s, primarily because Charlotte had a reputation for being a very progressive city, primarily because of its road improvement program. And George Stevens married Jack Myers' daughter. So George Stevens, of course, knew his father-in-law, and George Stevens shared Jack Myers' love of beauty. And George Stevens became very much involved in the real estate business, development business. And he also, as almost anyone who was a young man in Charlotte in the early 20th century, got to know the man that I would say, from an economic development perspective, is the single most important person in the post-Civil War history of Charlotte. And I mean, I'm talking about the whole up until today. And that is a man named Daniel Augustus Tompkins. And I could go on and on about Daniel Augustus Tompkins. There are many things about him that, from today's perspective, would be very, very disturbing. He was clearly a white supremacist. He was a man who basically used race as a wedge issue to divide African Americans from linking up with whites to advance what Tompkins regarded as threatening political and social issues. He was one of the main advocates for disenfranchisement of blacks that occurred as a result of poll taxes and literacy tests and all kinds of other provisions that were. So there are many things about it. He was a social Darwinist, survival of the fittest, and all of that. But he founded the Modern Charlotte Observer. He really created the cottonseed oil business. He was a New South industrialist. He believed that the South, in order to regain a position of significance in the country, must emulate Northern industrialization. And he also was a big proponent that Charlotte needed to have parks. And that's how Stevens and Tompkins really linked up, because Stevens agreed that a city, to be a place that was humane and uplifting, must have a place for people to recreate. There was no public park of any significance in Charlotte when George Stevens came here soon after 1900. And he and Tompkins really began to think about how to create a park. Now, the first development that Stevens was involved in was a Piedmont Park, which was essentially off Central Avenue. We're talking about Sunnyside Avenue. We're talking about the area that is over around Piedmont Middle School. He created what was called the Sunnyside Rose Garden, which has now been completely sacrificed to the John Belt Freeway. But there was this passion that Stevens had for the fact that a city should not just be functional, but a city should be beautiful, that it ought to uplift people. And Tompkins and Stevens on the City Park Commission hired a young graduate. Well, he was in his 30s, but to me, being 60s, you know. Anyway, they hired John Nolan, who was a graduate of Harvard, who was a landscape architect. And anybody who knows landscape architecture history in the United States knows the name John Nolan. I mean, Nolan is a huge name. He's really as big a name really as Frederick Law Olmsted. I mean, they're the giants of the so-called city beautiful movement. That parks and beauty and trees and curvilinear streets, and we ought to create places for people to live that uplift them. The built environment should uplift people. And they hired Nolan to design the first city park of substance and significance, Independence Park. And of course, it's still there. Independence Park has been brutalized, as so much of what was done by the City Beautiful movement has been brutalized in Charlotte. But nonetheless, this is on East 7th Street. These steps lead down from East 7th Street to Independence Park. And you can see the use of stone, and you can see the sort of aesthetic that Nolan was very much drawn to. You know, I would encourage any of you, if you really want to get a feel for John Nolan's brilliance, and he was a brilliant designer, to go to Park Drive and drive around the eastern end of Independence Park. And it really is one of the most delightful spaces in the city. And Nolan really left an impression in Charlotte. He gave lectures. He even had illustrations. And, you know, Nolan made a real major impact on Stevens. I mean, Stevens was blown away by Nolan's vision of the future. And, you know, things, for instance, it says here, look what this is from 1907. The results of the effort of Mr. John Nolan to arouse interest in parks, playgrounds, and the beautifying of yards is becoming apparent. For one thing, Charlotte citizens, through Mr. George Stevens, offers a prize for beautiful yards. So you can see that there was an influence. And by the way, Stevens hired Nolan to design Canoga in 1909. Now, Canoga, was a sort of getaway place for contemplative rich people south of Asheville. It's now a place that is run by the Episcopal Church. But you can see this big influence that's growing. Now, here you've got George Stevens, influenced by Nolan. He's Jack Myers' son-in-law. Jack Myers owns this farm. And Stevens comes up with this idea, why don't I hire John Nolan to take Jack Myers, my father-in-law's vision for a beautiful suburb southeast of Charlotte, and have Nolan make it something that's even more special. Now this brings us to good old Myers Park. You are looking on Hawthorne toward the beginnings of Queens Road right here. The cross street that you see there in front of you is 4th Street. What is now Presbyterian Hospital would be to your immediate left. If you drive up Elizabeth Avenue, as many of you do, and you take a right, you go right down this hill. I'm sure many of you have done it time and time again. Now, Stefan could probably talk about this better than I could, but talking about principles of design, particularly when you're talking about what do you do with essentially a treeless farm, because that's what the vast majority of Myers Park was. It was a treeless former cotton farm. One of the fundamental principles of design is to give people a sense of arrival. You know, if you go to a sort of gated community, and of course we have gated communities now, you know, one of the big things is, how do you get a sense of arriving at that particular community? Now, clearly the thing that made Myers Park possible was electric streetcars. Now, electric streetcars were a subset of these vehicles. Some of them were powered by steam, which was not practical. Some of them were pulled by horses or mules, which of course limited the amount of distance. But really what transformed the streetcar was the development of electric streetcars with an overhead wire. Cable cars also were possible, but cable cars, which essentially were simply cars that latched onto an underground cable, which were broadly used in the country, were very, very, very expensive. And the first electric streetcar system in the world was introduced in Richmond, Virginia. And electric streetcars are as southern as grits. And the streetcar really made it possible because now you could live much farther out from the city. So everything in Myers Park is organized around the streetcar. And I just want you to look at this wonderful entrance that existed at the corner of Queens Road and 4th Street. I mean, I look at that, this sort of rectilinear style that was used. And you remember we talked about before that stone was something that, stone is really the most enduring material that's provided by nature. Stone has such symbolism to them. You think about the temple in Jerusalem. You think about what it means that was built of stone, the wall which remains, and the sense of permanency that stone provides. Well, think what a different experience it would be of, quote, going to Myers Park if that still existed today. Now you can see that the entrance included two things. First of all, you had two waiting stations on either side. Because if you were going to be waiting for the streetcar, you would wait for it to come to the station in the middle. And then, of course, you'd walk across the street, go in, get on the streetcar, and you would either ride it uptown or you'd ride it farther into Myers Park itself. Now, anybody got any comment about the impact that looking at that photograph, anybody got any thoughts about something that strikes you about it? Anybody? Stefan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. So for one is there are several things that strike me. One is the wonderful scale. So there is the human pedestrian scale for the sort of entries to the sidewalks, the two sidewalks to Myers Park that are at the pedestrian scale, and then the electric cart in the middle, which is much larger. And the whole thing is also done in a style that was quite prevalent at that time. It was more original to California than actually to this area, and it was called the arts and crafts movement. And therefore the stone and some of the aesthetics.
Yeah, so we're going to see, you're going to see, in fact, keep your microphone on, Stefan, because when I get to some of the other architectural things, now let's look at this intersection today. You want to look at it today? Now, obviously, the central waiting station is gone. It's eliminated. And that was done in the 1930s. And see, the thing that dominates the built environment, that overwhelms the built environment, is the automobile. The automobile is the master of our destiny. It's amazing how many people are killed every year in automobiles. Thousands. How many people? I'm sure there are people in this room that have had a tragedy in their family somehow associated with an automobile. And we pay a tremendous price for the convenience of not having to wait for anything. Go out, get the automobile, and go forward. It was sacrificed because the station in the middle was sacrificed because the trolley cars were eliminated, taken out in 1938. Therefore, there was no need to get on the streetcar anymore. And also, of course, the the need of a left turn lane. I mean, that's why it was eliminated, left turn lane. Now, the little waiting stations on either side are still there. Now, it's interesting, the one here on the left was going to be torn down. These are both historic landmarks, by the way. They're under the control of the Historic Landmarks Commission. And the Historic Landmarks Commission was able, they're building a huge medical facility. Some of you have seen it under construction, which is being built between 3rd and 4th Street, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But there are going to be all kinds of people coming in what? Automobiles, to turn in, to go in, to get treatment at this particular place. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not trying to denigrate automobiles, but they said we gotta take that station down because we need a right turn lane for people to be able to turn into this facility. And we said you can't do it. And what they did was move the turn lane up a few feet and kept the station. So it's still there. Now, this was a massive thing that was done in July 1961. And by the way, if I'm boring y'all, tell me I'm fine. Anyway, look what a difference this made. Do you see the red arrow? See the red arrow that points toward the waiting station? The waiting station is right there. See it? There's the waiting station. You used to come down Providence Road, and this was still true. I started dating my wonderful wife coming to Charlotte in 1957. And it was still true that you came down Providence Road to Caswell, and you couldn't go straight. It ended right there. You had to turn right, go up to Caswell to 4th Street. Here's Randolph going here, and then you turn left to go into the center city. Well, we come back to the automobile again, my friends. God bless the automobile. The idea was that was not efficient. Therefore, in July 1961, they created what was called the 3rd Street Connector. In other words, they blew this street straight through here with the white arrows. Now you see what that did to Queens Road. In other words, the whole edge of Myers Park got destroyed as a result of that, of putting that street through there. Stefan, is your microphone still on?
Yes.
You understand, you see how they put that street, and I drive down that street every day, right? What's your reaction to the decisions that were made to do that, Stefan? You got any thoughts about that?
It's sort of interesting what happened, because if you look as you drive along there, what was basically a residential neighborhood with very nice homes and so on, along the street now became commercial. And of course, the huge Harris Theater on the corner where you turn is just so pedestrian unfriendly. So the scale of the street along that side and the characteristics of the street has changed quite a bit.
Well, the big thing is, of course, this is where Novant is now built, that huge building, you know, where they had to have the right turn lane to get into. So all this has been obliterated. All this has been obliterated. And the whole sense of entry into Myers Park has been, it's just been taken away. I mean, that's what happened. Okay, now let me see if I can get me here. Now, you were talking about the arts and crafts movement and the streetcar. Now, there are a series of streetcar weighing stations. There's only one original one left other than the one at the entrance to the neighborhood. This is the two at the entrance to the neighborhood. This is at the corner of Hermitage Road and Queens Road. And you notice there's a little plaque on it. That, of course, is to indicate it was a streetcar weighing station. And even Nolan also designed the Hermitage Court, which runs off of, and you see that same arts and crafts movement, that same. Now, there's the blessed streetcar. That's what made all this possible. That was the whole concept. Now, another name I need to mention in addition to George Stevens is Earl Sumner Draper. Earl Sumner Draper worked for John Nolan. He worked for John Nolan. And he was the on-site guy. Nolan did the plan, the concept, but then Nolan went on to do other work. And Earl Sumner Draper has a tremendous impact on Myers Park. He designed Eastover. He had a tremendous impact on it, but he was very much similarly devoted to the City Beautiful movement. Now, I'm going to go through these slides real fast, but they simply illustrate that one of the things that Nolan said was you must have trees. Remember, it was essentially a treeless cotton farm. And I'll just go through these to show you the effort that Draper, who was the man who really supervised this whole operation, the amount of time and energy and effort they put into making this into a forest. They even brought, big trees with big root balls in to try to stimulate and accelerate the process. And their concept was that the houses that were built in Myers Park were to be, first of all, on curvilinear streets. And I could go on and on about curvilinear streets. Nature is all about curves. Engineers are about straight lines. Now here, for example, they're building Queens Road here. This is the main thoroughfare of the neighborhood. And you can see what kind of tree cover they had to begin to work with, what they were working with. Now, this is Queens Road. Many of you drive up this all the time. In fact, I'll show you, that's the same. See where these men are standing? It's right up here. This, of course, was this is where the streetcar ran. This median, this broad median is where the streetcar ran. And this, one of the things that's a real shame, in a sense, of Queens Road, it was not designed to be a major thoroughfare for automobiles. It was basically to be a very meandering type place, curvilinear, with the streetcar really being the predominant element. Named, of course, for the fact that it went to Queens College. Nolan persuaded an existing female college that was on North College Street to move to Myers Park. Because one of the concepts of design is not only to have an entrance, but also to have a distinct destination. And the destination of Queens Road was to be Queens College. And this next picture is really one of my favorite pictures because, we go by these buildings all the time. And yet when you see these automobiles, clearly that date from the 1920s, you can see that it's a whole different era that was aspect. Now here's the concept. This is obviously Ardsley Road. Here's the Duke Mansion over here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You can see the curvilinear street, and you can see planning for the tree cover, putting the trees in. And of course, this was what the vision was. You know, the idea was that the highest thing in the neighborhood was to be the tree cover. And as I have said, Draper and Nolan not only developed a street system, they also provided landscape plans, because this was a very holistic approach to design. And the idea almost was that the houses were almost to be tree ornaments. They were to be dominated by the trees. And you look at these places and spaces in Myers Park, and you know, if you brought Nolan back today, or you brought Earl Sumner Draper back today to look at Myers Park as it is, they would say, you know, we really did a good thing. This is Edge Hill. And let me show you this. This shows, to me, this really is an illustration of just how brilliant Nolan was. Obviously, a dominant element in any topography is water and streams. So many of the streams in Charlotte run along backyard borders. There are places that separate one backyard from another backyard. Notice that Nolan didn't do that. Nolan instead made the stream, if you will, the centerpiece of a park, that the people who lived on either side of Edge Hill Park could actually experience and see the stream. Here's the idea. Here's the idea. These houses are tree ornaments. Now, let me tell you, that as illustrated by what I showed you with the edge of Myers Park, with the destruction of the waiting station, with the building of the 3rd Street connector, we've also seen this whole concept brutalized. Stefan, is your microphone on?
Yes.
You want to respond to the placement of this on Queens Road? Does it stir anything in you?
Yeah, it's as we see sort of the progress of 20th and 21st century, some of the old homes are being torn down. The land is very, very valuable. And other buildings are occurring. So one of the things, particularly for people that still want to stay in Myers Park, but need more of an assistant and type of living, of smaller apartments, want to downsize. So there's an emergence of these condominiums that people are moving to. And of course, it changes the scale of the street and the buildings. And it doesn't have the elegance of the materials and the proportions and the details that some of the older houses had. So it's, even though it's very utilitarian, it serves a purpose, it certainly doesn't fit well into the area. There's also another thing, you were showing Hermitage Road, and there is one portion of, it's called the Hermitage Court. And of course, you know, Myers Park was more for well-to-do people, but those people needed service for one, and they needed gardeners, they needed other people, domestic people, and so on. And of course, then with the emergence of what used to be called Presbyterian Hospital, now it's Novan. There were nurses and doctors and so on that were not as wealthy. So Hermitage Court was designated for some of those people, and there were actually Sears catalog homes put in there. And they're actually beautiful. These are actually homes that you could select from a catalog from Sears Roebuck and put on a site. They were very affordable, very nice, very comfortable, a very predictable price. The lots, of course, were smaller than the rest of Myers Park, so it made it more affordable. But it allowed people of more modest means to live in right adjacent or to Myers Park. Today, the neighborhood, if you ever want to drive there, there's been a lot of renovation, but a lot of the homes have been saved and kept. And so even though additions were built and a lot of renovations occurred, they kept the character very, very well. And it's a very pleasant court, very pleasant area to visit. You can see
Stephen,
some of
thank
these
you.
condominiums that have
Stephen, let
arrived.
me ask you a question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
No,
have you ever heard the term parachute architecture?
what?
Parachute architecture.
Parachute? No, not exactly,
It
but I think
means
I know the
it,
meaning.
it means putting something in that has no sense of context whatsoever.
Yeah.
A sort of diminutive of parachute architecture in relationship to this building would be McMansions,
Yeah.
where you have a big house that's stuck right next to a smaller house.
There was a movement, which is kind of an embarrassing movement in the period of architecture. And some of these buildings are reflective of that. It was called the New Brutalism, and it was the movement of the 70s. And this is where these late 60s and around mid 70s and so on, that this building started arriving. And they're not the best examples of architecture and architectural imagination and creativity.
Well, many of you know this. Many of you know this building. It's on Queens Road. It's a boulder in a teacup. It's a boulder in a teacup. I'm not saying it's not, and by the way, it gives you a nice view of the center city, particularly if you go up high. But it's totally destructive of the vision that Stevens had, where buildings were supposed to be tree ornaments, but the tree cover was to be the dominant element. All right, let me tell you, how am I doing time-wise? Am I running over? I can shut up, by the way. How am I time-wise?
And I think you have another 10 minutes or so.
Well, then I got it. Man, I'm cool. Cool, man. Cool, man. The architecture, I wanted to talk a little bit about the architecture. This is the Simmons House, which was actually built in Hermitage Court by the people that developed Hermitage Court. Hermitage Court was a separate development from Myers Park, but it still was very much influenced by Nolan's input. And this, of course, this neoclassical house is at the corner of Hermitage Court and Hermitage Road. And it's been added on to and so forth and so on. But it's certainly a hearkening back to an earlier image of what indeed is classical beauty. And it's a unique feature in Myers Park and Hermitage Court. There is no other house like it. This is more that arts and crafts stuff that you're talking about. This is, I don't know if you need, this is an adaptive reuse building. This is the Jamison House, which was designed by Louis Asbury Sr. Now, Louis Asbury was a big Charlotte architect, and I could go on and on about Louis Asbury. Stephen, talk to me a minute about that style and that architecture? What's your reaction to it? Is built in 1913.
So in the
What
arts
does
and
that
crafts
say? What does that-
movement was sort of a reaction to, particularly to neoclassicism, where there was a
reaction to that, wasn't it? Reaction
yeah,
to that.
there was a reaction to that, and there was an attempt or a movement to use more natural and local materials, so a lot of stone was used, wood shakes for roofing rather than slate. It also made housing a little more affordable because the neoclassical mansions and neo-Georgian mansions were very, very expensive. So this made a little bit, made the houses more affordable. There was an emphasis on functionality inside the house rather than just exterior appearance.
Well, the earliest architecture of Myers Park is this arts and crafts architecture. I'll show you some other examples. You really want to know what the initial, you look at the waiting stations and the roofs that were used there, and you look at that entry trolley station that I showed earlier, you can see similarities. You can look at that, sort of really in essence, this was a look to the future. This was innovative. This was not replicative of a past image. Now, I'm about through. This house was built in 1915. This was George Stevens' house. This is where he and his wife Sophie lived. And this was built at the same location as where Jack Myers' farmhouse had been. And it's obviously a colonial revival. And colonial revival does become the dominant style in Myers Park. And here is the kind of ultimate example of that, and that's James Buchanan Duke. That's his daughter, Doris. I don't think I'd want to be Doris Duke. That must have been a very difficult life. He, of course, was a tycoon, lived in New York City, had an estate in New Jersey, but he became very much involved in the electrification of the Piedmont. He spent time in Charlotte. He wanted a home in Charlotte. Now, let me talk about this house. This is fascinating. Another huge name in Charlotte architecture is a man named Charles Christian Hook, C.C. Hook. This was the Z.V. Taylor house built in 1915. Now, I want you to look at this was the front of the house facing east. That's the house that we were just talking about. In 1920, Duke bought the house from Z.V. Taylor. This is no longer going to be the entrance. What he did, in essence, look here, see, there's the original house. What he did was replicate it over here and build a connector between the two. And that became the James P. Duke Mansion, which, of course, in many ways, to many people, is the symbolism of Myers Park. So that's it. I'm through. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Myers Park is truly a fascinating neighborhood. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you
Thank you
find
so
it
much.
interesting? Did you find it
Thank
interesting?
you.
Yes.
It is
I-
very interesting.
So,
Very
That's
much.
Thank you. Yes, wonderful.
Yes, thank you. It was great.
And thank you, Stefan, for augmenting it as well.
No, it was great.
Yes.
It was great. It was great. He was,
Great.
Stefan is, Stefan, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Stefan is truly, truly a wonderful friend. He really is. Do any of you have any questions or comments? I'd love to respond.
Jewish people were not really allowed into Myers Park. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. That was done by deed covenant. And the same thing was true, of course, of other marginalized groups. This was the only non-whites that were allowed to live in there were people who were servants. But you know, that, I mean, I'm not going to defend that, but you know, Nolan had to work within the confines of the environment. I mean, that wasn't his job. He was not a man that, I don't know what his political views were, but you're absolutely right. No question. It was to be an exclusively white Christian area. No question about it. It's very true.
Are all the homes on a, oh,
You know, I want to, yes, that is true. That is true. Yeah. Even though I was going to say there's a very, very significant house in Myers Park that belonged to Jacob Rentals. Jacob Rentals was a major Jewish figure, but when he owned it, it was on West Trade Street. And it was moved to Queens Road, but it's still there today. So it's a designated historic landmark.
You previously mentioned at the start of the talk someone whose name was Springs. Were they the owners of the Springs property that's in South Carolina?
Yes. Jack Myers did have family connections with that. I don't know exactly, but there was a family connection there. Absolutely.
That is a tremendous amount of property.
You know, the strange thing is, by the 50s and 60s, most of the Jewish population lived in the Myers Park area, and most of the Jewish teens went to high school at Myers Park, a few to east and a few at south. But it was the predominant place for Jews to live in the 50s, 60s.
We're going to break into groups.
I grew up here.
Do you have any information about the people that owned the farm that was on the Arboretum?
No, ma'am, I've never researched that. That would be easy to find out, but I do not. No, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm just thank you for having the opportunity to talk to you. You know, the thing about it is, when I hope some of you, one of the great things about local history is you drive by it every day. And, it's like any other history. If you don't know the history, you don't know the significance. But, I've had people tell me in the past that I didn't know what those little rock buildings were at the corner of Hawthorne and 4th Street. I had no idea what those little goofy things were. I've had people say, I never noticed them before, but they're there. They're there to be seen.
are all the homes on the historic register?
You mean in Myers Park?
Yeah.
Oh, no. In fact, there are a few historic landmarks in Myers Park, but most of the Myers Park homes have no special protection at all. They are subject to getting a demolition permit just like any other. In fact, have any of you heard the stories about David Ovens?
No. I have.
Well, what stories have you heard? I'd be interested. In what
I've heard
you
that David Evans was a Jewish man who would never admit he was Jewish.
That's
And I'm
right.
trying to think, Richard Klein told me stories about David Evans.
David Evans was the man who made Ivy's department store what Ivy's department store became. He was the brains behind it. David Evans also was a great lover of classical music. And Evans Auditorium, for example, is named for David Evans. He lived in Myers Park, and you're absolutely right. I've heard that story so many times, and he would never confess to being a Jew. Well, his house was torn down. The reason I brought it up was his house on Ardsley Road was torn down. And here's the thing, I mean, clearly to deny change is to deny life. And you can't keep everything. But, you know, I think before you tear something down, you ought to make an informed decision. And one of the informed decisions is to know something about its history. You know, when I drive by the house on Queens Road that was Jacob Reynolds' house, I think about Jacob Reynolds all the time. And Jacob Reynolds, the big names in Charlotte's Jewish history that I know from the late 19th century was Samuel Witkowski and Jacob Reynolds. They were both really, really big figures. And and of course, the thing that brought the surge of Jewish involvement in Charlotte was the railroad. It's when the railroad came in 1851 that you start seeing a greater variety of people moving into Charlotte. And there was a very, very vibrant Jewish community here in Charlotte in the 19th century. And of course, that Jewish cemetery out there on Statesville Road is, I mean, it's just a terrific historic site. I mean, absolutely terrific. And Jacob Reynolds and Samuel Witkowski are both buried there.
I can remember in the late 50s, early 60s, when the cloisters off of Providence Road was being developed, and it was considered the most fabulous neighborhood, you know, new neighborhood, and it was restricted, no Jews allowed. And the unusual thing was lots of Jewish families did move in there, and I know this because my parents tried to buy a lot in there, and the builder said, I have to buy the lot, you know, we can plan the house together, but I have to buy the lot, and then when it's finished, you pretend to buy it from me. And my father said, no, I'm not going where they won't sell a lot to me directly. But
you know,
the cloisters was restricted at that time too.
I have an interesting, in my personal history, my paternal grandfather was adopted, but everything suggests that he was of the Jewish faith, even though that ended with his adoption. But yeah, and I grew up in the South. I grew up in Winston-Salem. But and I say this, you know, values change so much. There was a young lady who was a fellow classmate of mine who invited me on one of these Sadie Hawkins Day dances. She invited me to go with her, and I accepted. And my father found out that she was Jewish, and boy, he really came down on me with a ton of bricks. He didn't find that. And he was from Michigan, by the way. He was not a Southerner.
Excuse me, Dan, you mentioned a fellow Reynolds, and also the fact that you grew up in Winston-Salem. Was,
Let me
he.
spell rentals. It's not his rentals was RINTELS, rentals, not
Oh,
REYNOLDS.
okay, because we took a day trip up to Winston-Salem just to see Rinalda.
Oh,
Very-
that's a great place. That's a great place.
Absolutely fabulous.
That's Charles Barton King. Now, did any of you know the El Villa on Providence Road? No, that was William Bottomley. Charles Barton King did some houses in Myers Park. Charles Barton King did Rinalda, which, by the way, is the same concept of the beauty. You know, beauty. That beauty is important. Well, Winston-Salem's a fascinating place, as is Charlotte. Charlotte is too.
Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate this. It's been fascinating for me, who's not a native here, certainly highly instructive, and gives us a feel for how the city developed and so forth. And I'm sure we'll invite you back to pick on another area as far as